One night, Reddit user, skeptical_Simon, decided to take a shortcut through a dark, narrow alley near his apartment. He'd passed through it 100 times, never thinking twice. But that night was different. As he walked, the air felt oddly still, and the usual hum of city noise seemed to fade away. It was like the world itself had gone quiet. He thought he heard footsteps behind him but dismissed it, assuming it was just someone walking faster than him. But then the steps stopped. For a moment, he felt a strange chill run down his spine, and he turned to glance over his shoulder. Nobody was there. He kept walking, but then he heard the footsteps again, this time quicker, as if someone was pacing him. His heart began to race. When he looked back again, the figure appeared out of nowhere, just a few feet behind him. He froze. There was no one else around. The figure was tall, wearing a hooded jacket. As it got closer, he realized something horrifying. Its face was completely blank, no features at all. The figure reached out for him, but before it could make contact, Simon sprinted out of the alley, never looking back. The thought of that faceless entity still haunts him. Then there's the story from Midnight_Explorer. He had always been fascinated by abandoned houses, the stories they told, and the memories they held. One day, while exploring an old mansion on the outskirts of town, he stumbled upon something far more sinister than he could ever imagine. The house had been empty for decades, yet when he wandered into the basement, he discovered a locked door. Curiosity got the better of him, and after finding a rusty key on the floor, he unlocked the door. What he found inside sent shivers down his spine, a collection of old, dusty journals, all written by different people, but there was one consistent theme: their experiences mirrored his own. Every person who had ever entered that house had documented their eerie encounters. As he flipped through the journals, he read about strange noises, shadowy figures, and unexplained events. But what made his blood run cold was the last entry. It was dated the day before, and the final line read, "I heard someone coming down the stairs." When Midnight_Explorer looked up from the journal, he was sure he heard footsteps coming from the attic above him. Lost_Traveler 86 had always loved hiking alone. It was his escape, the one time he felt truly free. But one particular hike in the mountains would forever change how he viewed solitude. It was a late afternoon, the sun dipping behind the peaks as he took the final trail back to his car. It was supposed to be an easy walk, a winding path that led straight back to the parking lot. But as he reached a clearing, he noticed something that made his blood run cold: a figure standing at the edge of the trees, staring at him. The figure didn't move. It didn't even blink. He thought it might be a fellow hiker, but as he looked closer, he realized that the figure was impossibly still, like a statue. And then, it began to move. Slowly at first, but with an unnatural fluidity that was impossible for any human to mimic. The figure began to follow him. At first, Lost_Traveler 86 tried to ignore it, thinking he was just being paranoid. But the closer he got to his car, the closer the figure got. His heart began to race. When he reached the car and turned to look, the figure had vanished, as if it had never been there at all. But he was never the same after that day. The sense of being watched lingered long after he left the mountains. One Redditor, Urban_Scout, shared his chilling experience of walking home late one night when he began to feel a strange sense of unease. The feeling of being followed had started innocuously enough, like someone behind him was trying to catch up. He'd speed up a bit, then slow down, and the footsteps would match his pace. It wasn't until he reached a streetlight that he finally turned around. He saw nothing, but when he turned back toward the street, he froze. A dark figure stood under the lamp, staring directly at him. The figure was still, not moving, not even twitching. As he began to walk away, he could feel it, he was being followed again. This time, the figure moved, slowly but deliberately. It wasn't until he got home and checked the street cam footage the next morning that he saw it. A tall, shadowy figure had been lurking just behind him, standing still under each light he passed. It was only when the video was slowed down that he could see the face, if you could even call it a face. It was a blur. Like a distorted mask, one that didn't belong. The most terrifying part. The figure wasn't visible in the footage until the exact moment he looked back. Skyline_watcher had always loved the idea of exploring old, secluded cemeteries. They held a strange allure for him. One evening, he decided to visit a particularly remote one, hidden deep in the woods. As he wandered between the tombstones, he came across a small, unmarked grave. The ground was fresh, the dirt still soft. As he knelt to examine it, he felt a sudden cold breeze, despite it being a warm summer evening. He heard a faint whisper behind him, soft but unmistakable, like a voice trying to say something from beyond the grave. Turning around, there was nothing. But when he looked back at the grave, he could see something strange, a shadowy figure standing beside the tombstone. The figure was too tall to be human, and its limbs were distorted, as though they were elongating unnaturally. Skyline_watcher snapped a photo, but the figure was gone by the time he looked through the lens. The only trace left behind was the photo, which showed the tombstone, and something else. The shadowy figure was still there, but not in any way that should have been possible. It wasn't just an image, it felt real, like something was standing right next to him. He left the cemetery in a hurry and never went back. Night_observer had a terrifying experience in the middle of a normal evening, sitting in her living room. The night had been calm, the kind of stillness that invites a sense of comfort. But as she glanced up at the window, she saw something in the reflection. At first, she thought it was her own silhouette. But when she looked directly at the window, there was nothing. She turned back to the reflection, and this time, she saw a figure standing behind her. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a person, pale, gaunt, and staring directly at her. The reflection didn't move, but when she turned to face the room, the figure was gone. She was alone. But when she checked the security footage from that night, it showed something she couldn't explain. The figure had been there all along. It wasn't a trick of the light or her imagination. It was real. And the most terrifying part, the figure was standing directly behind her, staring at her every move. Finally, we have the tale of Dreamwalker 74. It was a simple camping trip in a remote area, just a small group of friends getting away for the weekend. The area was known for its isolation, surrounded by dense forests and mountains. Everything started well, until they set up camp near an old, abandoned mine. As the night fell, they started hearing strange sounds, low, rumbling noises that seemed to come from deep underground. At first, they dismissed it, thinking it was just the wind or some animal. But the sounds grew louder, and then, they started hearing whispers. It wasn't until one of the friends, who had wandered off a little to explore, returned looking terrified that they realized something was wrong. He had seen something in the mine, a figure that seemed to move just beyond the reach of his flashlight. They packed up and left immediately, but the whispers followed them, growing louder as they hiked back to their car. When they finally reached the parking lot, they saw something they would never forget, the figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, watching them. But it wasn't just standing there, it was moving, walking toward them with long, slow steps. They didn't wait to see what happened next. They drove off, leaving the mine behind, but the feeling of being followed remained.